So I wanted to just welcome everybody to this event. It's a hybrid event. So the title, as you probably know because you're here, is Information Ecosystems and a Troubled Democracy. So we'll be hearing from a series of very distinguished people who worked on this report or who's going to discuss this. My name, for those of you who don't know, is I'm not Sonia Livingston. She was unfortunately not able to be here to chair this event, but I'm very delighted and honored in a way to be able to take over for her. I'm Ellen Helsper. I'm a professor of social and digital inequalities at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the Media and Communications Department. I'm very pleased to welcome, as I already said, our speakers here today, Emma Gruden, Professor Matthias Kettemann, and Professor Emerita, our very own Robin Mansell, and of course, Professor Nick Couldry, who will be our discussant for today. I want to welcome both our online audience, but also the people here in the room. So what we're going to be talking about today or discussing today is this cross-disciplinary media and communications, law, computer science, sociology, this report that covers media technology and governance in the global north and the global south. But on a scale that is really kind of ambitious and unusual in this field, I would say. And I'm really looking forward how kind of this state-of-the-art report is going to be discussed and how it came to be, but also what the findings are and how our distinguished speakers are going to reflect on this. So a little bit more of an introduction before, obviously, I'm going to stop talking because it's about presenting this report. Emma Gruden, who is working at the Forum on Information and Democracy in Paris as the policy officer for media and big tech, I believe. She was also the major project officer for the report that we're discussing today and had the colossal task of coordinating upwards of 300, I think, global contributors and 7 rapporteurs and all the other people who are in this room. So for the corpus and the database and endless drafts that were part of to come to this final product. But we'll also hear from Robin Mansell, our emeritus professor in the Department of Media and Communications, who is currently the scientific director at the Observatory, I believe, of Information and Democracy at the Forum. She is also very actively involved still in research on digital governance and regulation and supervising PhD researchers in our own department. Matthias Kettemann is a university professor for, I'm going to read this out, Innovation Theory and Philosophy of Law at the Institute for Theory and the Future of Law at the University of Innsbruck, but also has, he was a reporter for the report theme, right, on AI and information ecosystems, but also holds positions at the Hans Bredel Institute in Hamburg and the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin. And then last but not least, our discussant, Nick Couldry, who is a sociologist of media and culture and professor in media and communications and social theory at the London School of Economics, where we are here today, and have just published a book, I think, which is relevant to what we're talking about today, Space of the World, right? Can human solidarity survive social media? And what if it can't, I think is kind of important addition to that question. And it's also working at the Harvard Klein as a faculty associate, Harvard Klein Center for Internet and Society. So for those of you who still use Twitter/X, there is a hashtag that, and also for the people online, obviously, which is hashtag LSE Media, I believe. I would ask you to, if you're in the audience online, you can mute your mic, but in the audience, please turn off your mobile phones, the sound, so that it doesn't interrupt the proceedings of today. There will be a chance for you to put in your questions to our speakers in the room. Please I will let you know when we open the floor for questions. We'll have a roving mic, so please raise your hand and wait for the mic to come to you. Introduce yourself and to tell us a bit your name and your affiliation. And online, you could use the Q&A feature, please. So not the chat feature, as that's available to you, but the Q&A feature and in your response, please also include your name and affiliation. We'll try to ensure that we get a questions both from online and offline when the time that we get to that stage. But I think we should get to what we're really here for today, is to hear about the report and your reflections on it. And we'll start with Tamara. So please, I think you're going to come up here.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Professor Helser, and thank you to the Department of Media and Communication at LC for hosting this event and having us. It's a great honor for us. And also thank you to our panelists today, Professor Couldry, Professor Kettemann, and our dear scientific director, Robin Mansell. So I will just start by giving a short introduction about our organization, the Forum on Information and Democracy, and our project, the Observatory, before we delve into the findings. So we are a Paris-based NGO that was created 5 years ago by 11 NGOs, among which Reporters Without Borders. And we act as the implementing entity of a partnership, the International Partnership on Information and Democracy, which is an intergovernmental agreement between 55 states today to implement democratic principles and safeguard them in the online space. So we act as the implementation entity of this partnership. We have produced over the last years a set of policy recommendations with our wide network of experts. So the topics were stemming from public interest AI to disinformation and sustainability of journalism. And a couple of years ago, we also had the reflection that in order to actually produce evidence-based recommendation, we needed to have a collective and shared understanding of what of how the changing technological and political landscape is affecting our democracies and what is at stake. So in order to inform the international community and produce more effective and meaningful recommendations, we launched a prefiguration group, which was led by Shoshana Zuboff, which is the author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and André Boria, former Secretary General of the OECD, to create this sort of entity that is a bit like the panel on climate change, to produce meta research reports that provide a comprehensive overview of what we know, what does scientists say about the information space, what is AI's impact on democracies, what is disinformation's impact, what do we agree on, what don't we know, and where do we need to focus our research. So we launched our first cycle a year and a half ago with a steering committee of 19 international experts, among which we have Francis Haugen and other leading experts in the field. The whole process this last year and a half was highly consultative. We, as is shown, consulted over 400 experts from academia and civil society, but also held technical meetings with regulators and government representatives of the 50 states. We also held one meeting with private companies at the beginning of the process, but they had no editorial oversight on the report and the production. We started by launching global calls for papers and received a lot, but pretty soon saw a big imbalance in where we received most papers focused on the global north. So we launched a second one focused on the global majority. And how we processed was we divided our report into 3 big thematics, very broad: AI, media, and data governance. We analyzed these topics through the lens of mis and disinformation. 3 working groups of approximately 20 voluntary contributors worked on them. They were led by two rapporteurs, among which we had Matthias Kettemann, who led the AI working group, and our scientific director also had oversight on these three working groups. So the report, as I covers those three thematics through disinformation. Our data is re-aggregated over almost 3,000 sources, but 2,700 of academic, 1,600 were directly cited in the report. The purpose covers 84 countries, 9 chapters, and 300 pages. In addition to the 300-page report, we also produced a number of summaries for different audiences. So one for policymakers and big tech, one that is a 3-page summary, the executive summary, and one with the research priorities. We also launched a dedicated website of the observatory, which features interactive bibliography, which is just an alternative of seeing our bibliography that is more visual. You can zoom in and you can see the corpus, the thematic overlaps, the gaps. So I don't know if you can see the link to the website. It's here. I invite you to check it out. It's really well made, and so yeah, we hope this first global assessment provides a blueprint for open source collaborative research methodologies and a beacon for policymakers who are eager to implement evidence-based and future-proof regulatory frameworks. I hope you find the resource useful. You can see all the full report and the report summaries on our website. Now I will pass on to our scientific director, Robin, to delve more into the findings. Thank you very much.
Wait, thank you all so much for coming. I'm delighted to be here. Some of you may know that I retired a couple of years ago, and I no sooner retired, but rehired, as you've just heard, as scientific director for this big project. So with the 2 minutes that I have, it's absolutely not going to be possible, obviously, to talk to you about a whole 300-page report. So my ambition is going to be to highlight a few aspects. You ready? Yep. Right. So you've already heard about what the big themes were, and I'm not going to be able to cover each one of them in any detail. But I'm not sure if you can see because the chairs are in the way, but this is the work of the writing work of all of these authors. One of whom is Rob Proctor, who we haven't recognized yet. He was the lead rapporteur for the project, and he's sitting over there. So hopefully he will have a few things to say in the course of the evening. But I wanted to start, first of all, by talking about some of the terminology we used in this report. We adopted the language of information ecosystems. For some academics, this is quite controversial because there are some very critical academics who say, talk about ecosystems is actually a way of almost say pandering to big tech because they use the term ecosystems. But what we took when we used this terminology was partly to be able to be recognized by many of the people out there who have begun to use this discourse. But we defined it somewhat differently from the mainstream, if you like, way of defining it. So although we did recognize that information ecosystems, as you can see in this complex diagram, are comprised of all sorts of elements, infrastructure, service application layer, etc. And that all of the components are interdependent. We defined ecosystems as being about people, practices, values, institutions, and technologies. Now, what is special about that? It is special because much of the mainstream literature starts with technologies, the big tech push idea, and we wanted to move away from that. We also wanted to be able to reflect in our work when we looked at other people's research on the extent to which they highlighted socio-technical kinds of issues. So we were as interested in issues of culture and diversity as we were in the affordances of technologies. We were interested in institutions of all kinds, public and private, and hybrid in some cases. So that was the way in which we talked about information ecosystems. We then had to talk about information. And as some of you will know, there's an awful lot of research out there that starts with information. And it's about information, it's about information, it's about media, it's about communication. And so again, in order to be able to be recognized by some of the big international intergovernmental institutions, which are looking at what they call information integrity, we did use the definition which the UN Global Digital Compact is using, which is access to relevant, reliable, and accurate information and knowledge. But again, we were different from some of the mainstream literature in the sense that we tried very hard to try to understand information in terms of issues of its production, processing, and circulation that have to do with power relations. You won't see power mentioned very often in some of the UN documents. We also were very concerned with what is called epistemic privileging. In other words, whose knowledge and whose information is taken as reliable and accurate and credible. So this kind of distances us a little bit in terms of our perspective on the literature. And then finally, we were overall interested in mis and disinformation. And in this day and age, and particularly in recent months, this is a huge theme that affects many, many different aspects of everyone's lives and livelihoods these days. Well, we recognized it as only one factor, which is troubling for democracy. We did recognize that as information circulates and escalates in social media, it is often an amplifier of big changes in societies, yes. But what we were interested in doing was to try to tease out what factors such as inequality, such as biases, such as other aspects of the way in which business models, for example, of big tech companies are configured, what difference those kinds of things make to the changes we're seeing in societies around the world. So that was kind of the framing of the project that we undertook. If you want to take a global look at what did we find, I'll be very quick about this. Basically, we found an enormous polarization, if you like, between studies that look at the effects and impact of information or mis and disinformation on individuals versus, if you like, a lot of research that looks at structural, institutional, market analyses of power relations. And that is, in some ways, not surprising, but it needs to be said because so much investment goes into the first kind of information, effects, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes. And the other thing that we were able to demonstrate, and you heard that we looked at over 3,000 different citations from various literatures. Research in this whole area is hugely biased towards dependence on US or Western evidence. And the result of that biasing is that many of the policy measures which are used when we talk about combating mis and disinformation are informed by the experience of the United States or Western European countries, which then results in, when put into practice, all sorts of exclusions or inequitable inclusions, which are, some are intended, some are unintended. That is the result of being so heavily or influenced by research that comes from the richer countries. So that's a sort of top level look at the report. I wanted to mention a theme that was constant throughout the report, and that was human rights and the relationship between efforts to combat mis and disinformation and efforts to stop the behavior of some of the actors who produce this kind of information in the first place. So our report was really very much framed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and most of you will be familiar with Article 19. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression and opinion. Yes? But how often do you see in the next sentence, Article 29, which says, and this is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that limitations, if they're proportionate, if they're proportional, are to be expected in order to respect the rights and freedoms of others. In other words, it's not just the speaker who has rights, it's the listener as well. There's a relationship. This is not just about individuals. So what did we find as we went through all of this literature? Enormously diverse interpretations of what that language means when put into practice. From everything from free speech absolutism, which you can't escape these days with the election of Trump, to autocratic kinds of interpretations, which are usually called censorship. Infringements on universally protected rights happen when measures are untransparent in practice. So countries may be signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but in practice, they do different things. And so if there was a message there, it was really that any kinds of implementations have to be independent and accountable. I had put the scales of justice there, with oligarchs down somewhat, and the people up somewhat. A lot of literature talks about the need for balance between the interests of people and the interests of companies and governments, etc. In my view, and I think the view of most of us authors of this report, it's not just a matter of balancing. It is the need for enormous rebalancing to push up the interests of people, not just assume that somehow we can reach some very nice equilibrium. I thought since this is the Media and Communications Department, I would just quickly say something about news trust, consumption, and news avoidance. I'm not going to go through all of these numbers. And we didn't do original research ourselves. We were very much based on global studies that have been done by others, and in particular the Reuters Digital, Reuters Institute for Journalism at Oxford. Basically, what we found, in some ways not surprisingly, but enormous differences in the ways in which countries are experiencing declining or sometimes increasing trust in news media. Quite often, if you read the press, you get the feeling that trust is declining everywhere all at once. That simply is not the case. There are enormous differences in the ways in which people encounter the news. And there are also big differences in whether they are shifting from legacy to online news and their dependence on partisan content and influencers. All of this varies by country. Why? I come back to our starting definition of information ecosystems, because it's not all about information itself. It's not all about technology. It's about the socio-technical context, the politics, the institutions. So that was something that we highlighted very much in the report. Another topic which is hugely topical these days is political polarization, whether it's happening in the United States, whether it's happening in the United Kingdom, or in countries in the global south. Elections are deemed to be influenced by this disinformation, whether it appears in legacy media or online media. What we found in the literature, again, was an enormous amount of studies of the effects of the impact of this kind of information on people's attitudes and behaviors. And what we found when we delved into this a little, and for media and communication students, you might find this a bit odd, the citations are so often to very old theories. Hypodermic model. You inoculate somebody against mis and disinformation, and all of a sudden they change their attitudes and behaviors, yes. Selective exposure, and a lot of research coming from behavioral economics and cognition studies. These studies are very much looking for monocausal impacts of information. And yet all of you students in our department know that communication is a relational phenomenon, that it's about mediation, that audiences are active, people interpret information in different ways, and yet this research is much neglected. We also found a lot of inconsistencies around claims that algorithms segregate people, they do personalize information, but that in and of itself, all by itself, doesn't fully explain polarization phenomena. We found this over and over again. We also found, and I find this rather odd, that there's far less research on who is motivated to weaponize information in the first place, whether it be political actors, whether it be radical groups on the left and the right. The studies of motivations of these actors and why they're getting involved for ideological reasons, for financial reasons, for all sorts of reasons, are far, far fewer than are these endless studies of effects. We also found that there are a lot of studies of whether fact-checking helps people to make sense of their informational environment, on whether you can use AI tools effectively to counter disinformation. And what we found here was a lot of the research in that area is experimental. It is short-term, one time only, not longitudinal. And again, it produces mixed results, often because it's very focused on information. And then lastly, we found enormous results, which would be of interest to Ellen, differences in results on the effectiveness of media and communication, information literacy, and AI literacy, which is concerning because governments around the world are hoping that improved critical literacy in terms of the way AI works, will help people to protect themselves from harmful information, putting much of the responsibility on individuals, less responsibility on institutions and corporations. So those are just some of the findings in that area. Let me coming close to the end. One of the big themes in the report was how to think about, imagine alternatives to the commercial datafication business models, which are everywhere, from the Metas, from the X's, from the Vivos, the big tech companies. So what we were interested in was research that tries to unpack the power dynamics that reinforce inequities in terms of outcomes when these big tech business models are being used. We looked at ways in which different groups are engaging politically in order to resist and reimagine the way in which information and communication ecosystems, if you like, could be and are not now. We have chapters in the report on what I would call top-down governance and regulation. So all of the legislation that you learn about from Europe, from countries around the world, like in this country, the Online Services Act, the Digital Services Act in the EU, and there are multiple legislations around the world. But what is a counter to that? How is it possible to organize and resist the way in which companies are deciding for themselves what kind of information environments we should have, and in some cases governments? So what does democratic contestation look like from the bottom up? And so in the report, we have many cases of individual self-defense strategies using VPNs, giving up using technology for a little while, maybe. We have many examples of public interest alternative news media and how they are being financed. Not all of them would be acceptable to all of us in the sense that much alternative media is right-wing, but there's also resistance coming from the left and the center ground. We looked at community strategies by Indigenous communities, and here I would highlight experiments with language, trying to ensure that their languages are represented. Municipal initiatives. Our colleague here at the LSE, Alison Powell, has done a lot of work on criticizing the approaches to smart cities. But there are examples around the world of resistance, the top-down smart city approach, and community-controlled technologies, data practices which adopt open, decentralized, federated, if you like, governance approaches. I see that I'm almost running out of time. This is my last slide. What can we conclude overall from a study like this? First of all, evidence is contested by stakeholders. There's nothing new there, but we get a profile of why it's contested. We find that although there are huge numbers of high-level principles, ethical statements, documents talking about the safety of the AI or of information ecosystems, and a lot of after-the-fact ex post interventions to mitigate harms, the implementation is uneven and the outcomes are uneven. We also find the repeated claims that if you intervene against big tech business models, you will harm innovation, you will slow down competitiveness, and this will be bad. And then if you believe Meta, you will be practicing institutionalized censorship. So what's the answer? And this is my last comment. We need to invest in research evidence into alternatives, into reimagining the way in which these systems could operate, and thinking through how the alternatives could be scaled up, what their costs are, and how people can be encouraged to be involved in them, whether it be to do with data governance, independent media, or collective control of information ecosystems. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak a bit about the work which I have been doing within the report, and also more broadly, since you read up all of that, on the role of law, of regulation within the ecosystem which we have been studying. I'm a lawyer. Don't hold that against me, but I'm one of the good ones. The ones that don't earn the money, but that do the thinking about the way we set good rules. And the point which you made at the end is such an important one that I want to start with it, namely that it is of course bad to harm innovation, but good rules don't harm innovation. They enable innovation. They safeguard innovation. Nobody looking at the current digital communication ecosystem would tell you, wow, we've done such an excellent job in providing rules over the last 2 decades, that all the digital services and the digital markets are working very well, and there have been no damages to innovation. That's just wrong. We haven't done a good job in regulating. We haven't done a good job in governing. We haven't done a good job in standard setting. We've done a decent job in providing, some of the basic rules for the stability of the internet as a whole, the naming spaces and the address spaces, but those are the boring parts. And they're boring because they're working well and nobody cares about them. The parts which people care about, bless you, and where they earn money, that's where the companies have been able to monopolize not only the political discussion of the last 2 decades, but also have been very successful in providing compelling narratives regarding how bad governance is. Again, governance regulation is not bad per se. It can be bad if the rules are bad, but if it's well made, governance is essential for good innovation. What developments have we seen in the report? What developments are important? Well, regarding the governance approaches, well, we're seeing 2 decades too late, but still a progressive responsibilization of digital services and digital platforms across the globe. It started with some first rules, some first norms in Germany. There were some court cases before that basically said, we are going to apply certain human rights standards to platforms. We're going to make them a bit more responsible. We're going to tell the platforms, these are your terms of service. You have to tell us about your terms of service. You have to stick to your terms of service. You cannot just arbitrarily decide what to do with your users. And also, by the way, as you are developing your content governance algorithms, it might be a fantastic idea to tell us a bit about that. The problem in online settings is not so much the illegal content. There is illegal content out there. About 1 in 100 pieces of content that platforms do something with is illegal. There's about, in the European context, about 5 out of 100 pieces that platforms do something with is illegal, because in Europe there's more illegal content. Why? Well, because there are more rules regarding what you can say and cannot say. Holocaust denial being the classical example. The US has a different approach. You talked about that, to what can be said online and what cannot be said online. But the key area where governance interventions, and we've seen that in the studies which we've looked at, the key area is not the unlawful content, but some of you might know that beautiful phrasing, the lawful but awful content, right? So that's the problem field. Those 99 pieces of content out of 100 which platforms do something with, which are awful but lawful. And those are the pieces that make the platform money. Why? Because they're usually engaging, they are emotionalizing, and platforms have used their algorithms, which are optimized for engagement, to show us more of that kind of content. And they've made money off of that. So when we ask about how to responsibilize platforms, digital services, and how to make digital markets work better, we have to focus on, and that's what the normative interventions we've looked at have done, we have to look at how platforms deal with lawful but awful content. Again, illegal content, platforms have to leave it anyway, they have to do a better job in doing it. When you mentioned the free speech absolutism that Musk and Zuckerberg and Trump proclaim to follow, I have I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding on part of those three policymakers, in the broader sense of the word. They are not free speech absolutists, because if they were, they wouldn't have any problem with the free speech they disagree with. They wouldn't have a problem with DEI initiatives. They wouldn't have a problem with speech protecting trans rights. They have a huge problem with that. Why? Well, because they're not free speech absolutists, because they are, let's put that nicely, it's a beautiful setting, tech bros with an agenda and a very, very soft and frail male ego, as male egos tend to be. And if we address those issues on a rational basis, we're not going to come very far, because it's not a rational discourse. This is First Amendment theater. So we have a gap. First of all, we're seeing a progressive responsibilization of digital services and platforms. The European Union and Great Britain have made important strides forward. The Online Safety Act has faults, but by and large, it does similar things as the Digital Services Act. It tries to make sure that platforms stick to the rules, they publish the rules, they ensure that the online space is slightly safer. But you cannot only rule through external rules, you also have to harness the intrinsic willingness to commit to ethical, to follow up ethical commitments. That's why we've seen the importance of voluntary guidelines, voluntary commitments, such as in the disinformation. Yes, over the last couple of months, there's been a tendency to reduce that willingness, but again, I think that's more theater than fact. One example for that is that just as Zuckerberg said that he would, reduce the automated moderation of this lawful but awful content, he submitted a adapted risk assessment to the European Commission showing, telling Trump that he still wants to keep the European market. So just as we're seeing this trend to responsibilize platforms over the last couple of years, we are seeing this, if you want to call it counter-enlightenment, that is a real challenge to the way that platforms act, and the way especially that AI systems are used within those platforms. Because one of the first acts that the US government has done is to withdraw, to do away with the sensible AI rules that the Biden administration had submitted. And platforms love that. AI companies love that. The studies which we have looked at within the AI field, however, show that it is dangerous to not provide ethical and legal rules as to the use of AI, especially in content governance. Why? Well, because I mentioned that for the last couple of decades, platforms have done a very good job in optimizing recommender systems, so the systems which recommend content to users, and to optimize them for engagement. And as they are progressively using AI to optimize further, we're seeing tendencies to, let's say, undervalue the ethical foundations of social and societal discourse, and optimize, as we've said, for engagement. Now, in order to test that, we need data. That's my third big point. We need facts and figures, and the studies which we've shown have been critical of the fact that we really haven't been able to look deeply under the hood of how those companies are using AI systems, recommender systems. The prime example of that is TikTok. I don't know who of you is using that platform, but have you noticed that the algorithmic suggestions are really well done? They're really addictive. Why? Well, because over the last 5-10 years, ByteDance has been allowed to use the data of 1 billion Chinese people to train their algorithms. Because ByteDance is a national champion under Chinese law and is exempt from competition and data protection rules. The other companies would wish they had so much freedom to harness data to train their algorithms. That's why it's a very good algorithm. That's why the US wants to get it as well. That's the very background of this prohibition law. Now, this goes to show, I would argue, that it makes a lot of sense to provide firm, stern rules as to how AI supported algorithmic decision-making system within companies can be used. So we need facts and figures to be able to study them, to question them, to query them. That is something without, pushing the message that Brussels knows best, but in that case, Brussels didn't know best. That the Digital Services Act contains, it has a clause saying that platforms have to divulge the optimization goals of their algorithmic content governance systems, including as they relate to risks. So platforms have to provide risk assessment of the rules and of the algorithmic moderation practices which they employ. We need facts and figures, and this cannot only be done locally or regionally, it has to be done globally, and reports like the one which before you today is, I would submit to you, an excellent, important, and essential tool to study the future of how governance interventions can be useful to safeguard societal and individual values. We have to chart a path forward, and we have to keep in mind that taking up a judgment by the German Constitutional Court in 2021, we have to take into account that we are not only protecting our freedoms today, we are also protecting the freedoms of the next generation. Just as we have to ensure today that we're not overusing natural resources and that we're fighting against climate change effectively. I would argue that we can read the judgment to say that we also have to ensure that we are not letting the communication ecosystem go down the drain. We have to make sure that the next generation and the generation after that, our children and the children of our children, are still able to develop political ideas, to voice opinions, to communicate effectively in online communication ecosystems which are vibrant and innovative, and where no single company and no single algorithmic recommender system rules them all. We need to develop such a common vision, but then we need facts and figures, and our report provides that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be the discussant of this huge 350-page report. And I want to strongly welcome this report for opening up big questions that are too often avoided. So if this disappoints you, sorry, but I'm not going to be offering a critique because I can't find a critique. Instead, I want to draw out some broader reasons why I think this report is very important. First of all, it moves, as Robin said, beyond the old business cliche of the information and technology ecosystems, which sounds so comforting, but is based around no care for nature at all. Instead, it wants to think about those ecosystems, those systems, as not just as self-stabilizing, as a sort of self-adjusting black box that we're not allowed to look into, but as complex systems that interact with the rest of society in ways that we have to investigate if we care about society. We must investigate those systems because they could be undermining the viability of many other social systems, including systems of democratic representation and decision-making. And I think the urgency of this broader critical approach today is increasingly clear. We need it. Tech systems, of course, have their own logic, their own clear logic, supporting a business model driven by engagement, as Matthias just said. But they interact with social worlds on various scales in ways that maybe, in fact, obviously are destabilizing those social systems. And here, and I don't know if this is one of the thousands of citations in the report, but for me, this report can be seen as answering a very important call in a paper about 4 years ago in 2020 made by Joseph Bat-Coleman and colleagues. It's published in the Proceedings of the US National Academy of Sciences, who called for a new crisis discipline across the whole of the social sciences to address the crisis in what they call global collective behavior. We are really messing up on a global scale, and they argue we're doing it because we have ever more intense digital interaction on scales which are completely different from previous human communities. We haven't a clue what that is doing. So they call for a crisis discipline to actually think about. And for me, this report is a perfect example of that crisis discipline. Whether you cite it or not, I think they're connected. That's one reason it's very important. The report is also vital, I think, because it focuses on the cognitive risks, the risks for human knowledge that follow when we adopt the wrong technological systems in our societies. When, as Robin Burgeon recently noted in a blog, the infrastructure of society's cognitive capacities, which societies obviously need, falls into narrow corporate hands rather than being under broader social control as it was in democracies and healthy societies until about 20 years ago. And we really have to monitor how this is operating, how our infrastructures of cognitive processing are operating, what they prioritize, who they favor, whose power they enhance. But such is the default power of today's infrastructures of social connection that it's private corporations, not communities or governments or societies, that have become the de facto sorts of governance for the very systems which they control and from which they profit, marking their own homework in the usual English phrase. They become private corporations, a quasi-governmental force that recently in the US, even worse, has become aligned with the most disturbing type of political project, which just happens to be occupying the seat of the most powerful person in the world. And I'd urge you to read Julie Cohen's recent paper published last week on oligarchy and the tech worlds. as we're using that word, it's clearly right. In the US, it's extremely disturbing. Report about the implications of it by one of our best legal theorists. And this means that if we are still to be able to imagine different futures, we have to have a vision of social justice in relation to information ecosystems. We cannot do without it. We need, in fact, a vision, as the report says, of data justice that reframes the narrow discourse of corporations and, sadly, those governments that seem to be in the thrall to corporate agendas. And for now, I'm afraid I would include the UK government amongst those. And this means, in turn, that as the report emphasizes, moving beyond a narrow individualistic market-based view of the problems with information flows, and instead seeing data and information flows as a much larger relational issue, an issue for all of us in our interconnections in society, as Robin said. A problem, again, as in our common resources, the resources we need to be together in society. Then we need to steward those ecosystems better. And that's, again, drawing on the title of that Joseph Bat-Coleman paper, stewarding our collective resources. How could we imagine it was okay to do other? And this is, however, very difficult when, as the report notes on page 158, the governments that are meant to secure that alternative framing to remind us we should be stewarding our resources and caring for them, themselves have fallen in love with narrow definitions of collective benefit that serve only corporate interests of various sorts, such as saving money, saving time, ensuring scalability, while overriding basic human needs. So we need, as the report calls for, richer notions of public good if we are to think seriously about today's digital information flows truly as ecosystems, truly as ecology. That is, to think about them with a full ecological responsibility, such as we, of course, assume in relation to the physical ecosystem. Ecosystem is just a cheap joke. It's not a serious attempt to think ecology. We need notions of public good that interrogate platform business models for their social consequences, I avoid the word effects, and hold them socially accountable for those consequences. And for me, this report offers a refreshingly different vision of how to govern tech, which genuinely asks the meta question, what would it be to govern tech? That's the thing really original about this report and completely distinguishes it from every other report I've seen in this area. What would it be to genuinely create a space for community consultation, a space of, as the report says, democratic data governance, an approach which will reject the assumption that it's always private commercial providers who are the privileged providers of solutions in this space, and therefore the privileged definers of which problems it is we're trying to solve. Because the problems that corporations want to solve are not the problems which societies need to solve. So a few final comments. I think this approach is particularly important today in relation to AI, when there's overwhelming general optimism about what AI can do and what it can transform. And I don't disagree with all that optimism. And yet we know there really are serious limits to how far AI can actually manage the huge issues, for example, with social media platforms. AI is not capable of moderating the hideous stuff on platforms. It simply isn't up to the scale of the task, unless the business models are challenged, because they are the key driver of the supply of this material and the acceleration, the amplification of the material. So that will be a skeptical approach to AI, which we desperately need. But I just want to underline the point, which is often ignored. There's a lot more societal skepticism about big tech and AI than is allowed. And it came out for me in an amazing survey. Sorry, I haven't got the precise citation. Picked up by Gabby Hinsliff in The Guardian 2 weeks ago, which reported that 2/3 of 16 to 24-year-olds in the UK believe that social media does more harm than good, so-called digital natives. the people who are social media, who it's for, who swim in it naturally. They're the ones who are skeptical, because they're the ones who are directly in the firing. They're not being listened to by this government. They're not being listened to by those who claim to want a balance. Businesses. So we need to tap into that real live social skepticism that's out there in society, particularly amongst young people. That leads to the penultimate point, which is that it's hugely welcome to have in a report of this authority the recognition of the epistemic injustices behind most knowledge production, and to recognize that we have to move outside the limits of the global norm, to listen to other voices, to listen to other ways of it. This is very rare, and it's extremely important, and it's particularly important, as the report underlines, against the massive and growing inequality in the world of actual economic resources, which make it virtually impossible, for example, for countries in Africa to build alternatives, and even if they wanted to be listened to in it, have any chance. They are silent in these debates because of the underlying economic inequalities. The final point and a question that I want to leave is this. What does it mean practically to democratize data governance? I accept the idea we need facts, but as a sociologist, I'm interested in what would these new sociological processes actually look like? They will in part have to be political processes. They won't fit well in the politics we have at the moment, let alone the geopolitics. Are they going to be based, we talk about bottom up, are they going to be based in some form of civil society rebellion, people refusing to use platforms? We don't know. I think we're going to need innovative sociological and civil society thinking about what it would look like to build a genuinely consultative socio-political process that could start to deliver and actualize the answers that this marvelous report insists we need to see. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you to come. We're going to try and minimize the video this in your face. Let's see if we can do it in such a way that I think the Starry Night is going to be less bothersome in your face instead of. Okay, so thank you so much for your presentation. We will now open the floor to questions, both online and in the room. So online, please put your questions in the Q&A and accompanied by your name and affiliation. And in the room, the same thing, but we're going to do it with raising hands and the microphone. Is that you were going to manage microphone? Okay, great. Just I will take a few questions at the time so that we can do it first. I'll start within the room. We've got a question here and there. 3 questions. I'll take 3 questions in a go, and then we'll have our panelists. So, who you are? And,
hello.
Yeah.
My name is Anne. I'm a student at LSE in the sociology department. My question was about if this study addresses bot content, bot generated, kind of dead internet theory adjacent, but just the fact that there's so much AI generated and fake, genuinely not human content online now.
Could you maybe pass the mic back 1 row? Yeah. And then we'll transfer the mic up. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Matthew Linares. I'm from Open Democracy. Point that I found interesting regarding the US ban on TikTok. I think you suggested that the ban was motivated potentially by a desire to get the ByteDance algorithm into US hands. And I think ByteDance is actually developing a US alternative to the algorithm in order to avoid that. But I found the point interesting in part because since the ban has come into force, US sectors have admitted that at least partially they were motivated by the popularity of Palestinian content on the platform. And it's interesting, therefore, that the most significant regulatory move we've seen so far in this whole arena seems to have been less to stop misinformation, but rather to stem popular opinion within populations. Yeah, I wonder if you have anything to say on that point.
with the right. You could pass this on to them. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Aidan Rayner. I'm a Canadian journalism student and a local reporter in a small town in Eastern Canada. How much of your kind of research looked at the impacts of the lack of kind of traditional fact-checked news media in Canada? Because obviously, like where we're seeing where the Canadian public is getting their information from, and like the current digital public square is largely on Meta, and there's just absolutely no news available. And like that's even our like national broadcaster and stuff like that. And we have an upcoming election with the like tech oligarchs have an active interest in a conservative government taking power over the liberals who want to do away with any sort of regulation or any sort of regulations and against these like tech companies. So yeah, I was just kind of wondering if what your report found on the effects of the like lack of traditional news.
Up to you how you want to respond and who wants to respond.
Rob, are you interested in doing the bot one? The question on bots?
Well, yes, okay.
Can we pass the mic so people online can hear? Sorry, I know it's a bit technology. Okay.
Well, I think we certainly need to be concerned that increasingly content that people access in social media or across the internet as a whole is generated by AI. And often there's no declaration about its provenance. And well, one issue that raises then is that as large language models continue to be trained on new content, they'll be trained on content that's been generated by previous versions of LLMs, large language models. So there are real questions there about the integrity of the data that is being used to train them as that becomes progressively diluted, or the human content becomes progressively diluted. I think that makes it very difficult to really be confident that the information that's generated by these bots actually represents the human curated epistemology, in which case I think we are really in dire straits.
Thank you very much. To the panel also to respond to the other questions.
Thank you very much. Just to add that not all bots content needs to be necessarily fake, right? I mean, fake in the sense of it's wrong, right? There can be good users as well. If you're interested in this topic, there's a big new project funded by the German National Science Foundation on automated speech, based at the University of Hamburg. It's really, they're doing good stuff there. Regarding the TikTok ban, now, it is of course always difficult to reconstruct political dynamics, especially in the US Congress. I think most people were just surprised that the ban went through and that the Biden administration didn't do anything against them and stop the ban. So I'm really not sure that we can subscribe or that there are any hidden motives. I think the motives which are out there are chaotic enough that I'm pretty sure that you can find that one you mentioned as well. I don't think it's a good example of governing at all. I think this is exactly what comes out of a chaotic, unplanned, and not approach to governing social media that is not at all targeted at ensuring individual and societal values. So that's how not to do it, which is a value in itself,
Shall I do the one on news media? I'm a Canadian. I don't know if you can tell from my accent, but I am. I've been here for 33 years, so I'm a little bit moved to, I'm not sure where. But in any case, in a report of this size, it was enormously difficult to reflect every country that we would like to. So when you ask, is Canada, given an in-depth case study? No. But we did talk in the report a lot about the financial instability of the legacy media. We had a member of the steering committee who was constantly on our case saying, you really need to pay attention to the way in which news media are becoming increasingly dependent on the platforms. This is relatively well known, but what's less relatively well known is the variability in the way that dependency articulates itself in different countries, which have different schemes for supporting journalism or not. And the emergence of news deserts is discussed. And yes, we do not think that we should just shift all of our attention to the online world as an intersection between the legacy media and those industries and what they are morphing into. And I think in the particular case of Canada, when Facebook shuts off news and there are wildfires burning in British Columbia, Alberta, or Northwest Territories, those people have no alternative, and that is dangerous. So thank you for the question.
Emma, did you want to respond to any of the questions, or I think there's online questions?
Yes, one question for Robin. Robin, you noted that motivations to weaponize disinformation are understudied. I'm wondering whether if the report uncovers or otherwise speaks to what are the factors feeding demand for disinformation from Daniel Pare, University of Ottawa. The second question is from Susan Abbott. How can we work together to evolve a set of principles and standards around norms and regularity approaches for a shared sensibility about the legal enabling environment for healthy information ecosystems?
Okay, is that question clear? Or do we yeah? Okay, thank you. Okay, Robin, there was one question specifically for you, but obviously
there is. Daniel, thank you for joining. It's lovely when former PhD students materialize in the ether. This one from Sussex. Motivations. I don't have a full answer. I think the reason why it is difficult to undertake research in this area is because imagine you're doing an interview-based study and you want to go and ask people why they're generating illegal or awful information. Are they really going to own up to it? So one source of information is probably missing. We had a master's student here at the LSE some years ago who had worked for years in public diplomacy in Australia and Montenegro, I think it was. And he managed to interview a lot of people who were engaged completely off the record in generating this kind of information, and it was a fascinating study, but it's one of the few that I have really seen. And then when you think about the oligarchs themselves, we have a student who's here tonight who is studying what some of us oligarchs at Facebook have to say from a historical perspective, but it's very difficult to do that research because you have to rely on public archives. So it's hard to get to grips with what the motivations are, what the tropes are that they're echoing. So I think more can be done, and I believe that as we see more of this sort of right-wing authoritarianism arising within democracies, people will become more interested in trying to understand what the motivations are of people who are generating this kind of information. And more research funding maybe will go into it, except we also see in the United States the politicization of this kind of research. So you dare to undertake research in this area in the United States in the moment and you lose your funding. There are instances happening in other parts of the world, and we do document the scale of the lack of freedom for academic research around the world, and it's really problematic. So that's the answer on that score. Demand is a funny concept. What is the demand for this kind of mis and disinformation? We've heard about how the algorithms themselves are set to push eyeballs of attention, and we are cognitively made up to be engaged. I can't think of anyone I know who doesn't get on their social media and get drawn in. So, it's because of the business model, and it is set up that way. So the notion of supply and demand in sort of in an antiseptic sort of sense, where you could kind of count suppliers and demanders and see how the balance is, I think just doesn't work. It's too mechanistic a concept. It's too economistic, dare I say, a concept, because the reasons why this phenomenon is happening are definitely to help make profits for the companies, but the model itself is not really based on our historical materialistic kind of notions of supply and demand. It's something much more complex and much more hard to grasp. And yet you can feel it when you want to resist it. It's just hard to name it. So I think there's a lot more thought needs to go into how we actually talk about this in the first place. So thank you.
Anybody else on your panel?
So a certain clever person called it surveillance economy. That model, data extractivism is one part of it, but yeah, we are definitely stuck with that model for quite some time, and we'll have to look into how best to deal with it societally. Now, regarding the question on shared value, shared normative goals, I don't see any global consensus emerging on governing social media. There are not going to be any substantial international treaties, there are not going to be any international conventions, there are not going to be any global soft law norms in the near future. The current geopolitical situation is unlikely to become better in the near future. However, we have seen in certain regions helpful developments. Europe in the broader sense, including the UK, we have developed these rules we've talked about briefly, where platforms are now obliged to publish the rules which they adhere to. They have to inform authorities, the Commission, for example, which risks lie within their systems and their algorithmic recommendation practices. It's less of a substantive approach, rather more of a procedural approach, where platforms have much freedom still, but they are under certain procedural obligations, which are necessary in order for policy makers to take good decisions. So I think that this will be the development which we can look forward to. We are seeing similar laws in California, for example, that are echoes of that approach. We're seeing similar laws in certain Asian states. Australia has a different approach, very much focused on minors, which might or might not work. So this is sort of the approach which I think will work within the near future. The AI field is a bit different. There's a bit more global commitments to common approaches. If you look into the UN Global Digital Compact, there's a willingness to discuss these issues, even though that consensus is also currently breaking up a bit because the Trump administration doesn't feel like they want to commit to any standards, as they have a mistaken view that standards are bad for business. Standards can be good for business if they're good standards, good rules, and for society, of course, too.
Could I add a little bit on this very, very important point, because I agree with Robin. Supply and demand, in other words, economic language, is not going to get us close. Whereas I think doubling down on the ecological approach will do. I mean, my book, I talk bluntly, this is a toxic ecology of communication. It's been poisoned. It's a non-linear process for sure, so it's very complex. So again, supply and demand won't get us close. It is non-linear. But it's non-linear in a way that we can describe under certain conditions, above all the business model, the various aspects of the business model, which guarantee toxic outcomes. And I think they should be identified legally. And Karen Jung, a legal scholar who used to be at King's, has now moved elsewhere, had a rather good non-linear concept of the hypernudge. That if you nudge every point in a space, a decision-making or choice space, you no longer have choice or decision. You have something systematically distorted. to go back to Habermas's old phrase. So I think we should draw on ecological language to introduce a new way of what we do to correct toxic ecologies. And that's not balancing supply and demand, and it's not tweaking at the edges. It's fundamental regulation, be my suggestion.
I was just going to reflect on what you just said and what you said in your comments about how do we do it. And almost every paper I've written in the last 15 years has ended with, we need to do something like this. And every referee's comment has come back and said, you need to say how. And I think the how, and I'm reflecting on the report now, the how is in so many ways contextual and place specific. Because what we are seeing now in so many ways, and it also reflects on what you said, is at the global level, there's a lot of people saying how. I mean, there's endless discourse on how the guidelines should be for AI and how we should regulate digital platforms, how we should be concerned with equity and safety and security and all of these things, which, you know, it's hard to disagree with most of them. But the line that says we need to do that and still respect the profiteering of these companies is also there. So let it take that line out. But it still doesn't tell you how. How would it be in Singapore? How would it be in South Africa or Eritrea, which is going to war again, I think, just now? You know, the circumstances in which people are living their lives, even when they do have the self-awareness through their communities of interest, not an individual thing, but something that they become aware of. And it's a bit like digital divide issues. How do you actually mobilize the collective institutions which can survive the onslaught of those who say, no, you mustn't disturb any of this, because if you do, people will suffer. They will become poor because there'll be a downturn in the economy and we have to drive the digital economy. And so then you become the person who is standing in the way of progress. And this dilemma is, what motivated me to say this is because I'm not entirely sure that saying we need to be ecological is the answer, because look what people are saying about the green movement, you know? I mean, the problem is this horrible contradiction and paradox that we seem in so many ways to be stuck, and I would never ever give up hope. But understanding how to mobilize change in this area, I think, is a huge issue for the future generations you were talking about.
To add on that, I think the thing which you mentioned regarding the Greens is such a good comparison, because across many Western states, the Greens are suffering a lot because their issues have now become mainstream. Everybody, you know, basically is green now. The majority of their issues have been taken up. And this, I think, has also happened to a certain degree with regard to social media, insofar as the majority of policymakers believes that something has to be done, right? And as you said, as you've written in your papers, something has to be done. And that is already, I know it's a small step forward, but it is a step forward. If we were talking to policymakers in the 2000s, and for the first 10 years of that time, it was a very much an uphill battle to convince them that they should provide rules for social media. Now, at least, they all realize that rules are important, and some areas have already have those rules. So we are moving into, I think, into a good direction, namely one where progressively we realize that either we need rules or we should implement the rules which we do have. That's really a good step into the right direction.
I think we have time. Are there more questions on that? No. Okay. So then we'll take exactly three, I see. And that's going to be the closing, because I'm afraid it's already. Make sure you introduce yourself so if you
Yes, my name is Ed Steinmiller, formerly of SPRU, now emeritus professor from the University of Sussex. My question is a little bit narrow, but has broader implications. The United States implemented something called Section 230, which made it, the provider or user of an interactive computer service should be treated as no provider or user of an interactive computer service should be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. And essentially what this then created an imbalance between the legacy media, as we now refer to them, and online services. Because legacy media was not indemnified, they were the speaker, they were the publisher. Whereas if a online service issues information, it is indemnified from any effect of that. Now, ironically, the Electronic Frontier Foundation valorizes and is all excited that this is upholding diversity of opinion and so forth. But it seems to me, based on what you've said today, that it actually serves very well to consolidate the oligarchy of the tech bros.
Thank you very much. I think we can pass it back, maybe. Is that possible? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Gregory, and I'm a lecturer at King's College. There is one concept that has been mentioned several times in the report, but not too much. But I think it's a very important concept which dominates the discourse today, and that's the concept of digital sovereignty. So I was wondering if, based on your findings, you consider digital sovereignty as a part of the problem or a part of the solution for the challenges that you cover as a part of your report. Thank you.
That maybe I will ask the panel to concise, like the question that we just had, a concise answer as well. Final question. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My name is Sian. I'm a postgrad student here at LSE. And I wanted to ask you, so a few months ago, Lawrence Lessig was here from the Harvard Law School, and he talked about AI impact on democracy. And he put forward, I think, a very interesting idea of a digital attention tax. And the idea is that actually certain time threshold, social media companies pay a tax if users are still on their platforms. So it disincentivizes keeping the users for too long. I think it's a cool idea because governments always like to get more tax income. And maybe you could draw kind of a similarity to maybe taxes on alcohol or cigarettes, where you can say, well, it's actually also damaging for mental health reasons, for instance. Just wanted to get to know your ideas or thoughts on that. Thank you.
Much for that question. Nick, I know.
No, it's okay.
Yeah,
I'll
it's
stay for
okay?
5 minutes.
So yeah, I will invite all panel members to kind of respond to the questions when they can and want to, and then we'll close off with that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. On tax first. Apart from that, nothing is certain about the taxes, right? Now, very briefly, countries are not at all doing a good job in applying the tax law which they do have on platforms. Europe isn't doing a good job. You know, the Dublin, it's not a big surprise why all the companies are headquartered in Ireland, you know, and the European Commission has to force Ireland to implement data protection and tax laws. So we don't really need a new tax. We're not going to get a new tax. We have to apply the tax laws which we have, and the European countries are not doing that. Apart from that, it's a fun idea. Section 230, famously called the 26 words that made the internet, is reflective of the fundamentally different role that content by third parties has for online media than it has for journalists and for traditional media. In traditional media, there's somebody who decides, usually the editor-in-chief, what is published in the newspaper. And it's not what 5,000 people are writing as letters to the editor without any control, but every single piece of content is decided upon. So that, I think, legitimizes the difference. But it also not only identifies companies regarding the content, it also identifies, more importantly, companies when they adapt which content gets online. So it identifies companies from, for example, filtering certain content or from hiding awful speech. So in that sense, I think Section 230, which has its faults, still is rather an important part of the online discourse. The role it plays for the historical development of the internet, I think, cannot be overstated. It's really an essential law.
Just on digital sovereignty, part of the problem and part of the answer. Sorry, I know I have to be brief, so a longer conversation.
Maybe I'll ask Emma to sum up what all of this has meant, but maybe Nick before.
On Larry just on Larry Lessig's tax, which I hadn't heard of, well, I don't buy it at all. I mean, it's attention to what? It's not just volume of attention, it's what you're looking at. Is it an obscene image or is it the news? So I don't think that works. And then what we should do is have governments imposing penal taxes on social media platforms for the ecological damage they've done, which could then be used to fund local press, public media, and fund community-based social media. And you also need regulators to allow people to transfer all their contacts when they get fed up with the platform. Then you might begin to have a change. The tax will help with that, but not Larry's tax, I don't think.
You want to go, Rob? We also have a reception, I think.
We have a reception to which you're all invited, but what I wanted to do was finish by thanking Emma, particularly, not only for being here, but because she bore the weight of a huge project, along with her colleague Iris, who unfortunately couldn't be here. And they did such a fantastic job that we said we wouldn't be here without her. So also to thank my colleague for coming. That's all from me. Thank you.
Emma, would you like to say something?
Well,
Not just about the huge amount of work it's been, but about what it's brought.
No, I mean, thank you so much again for having us, and it's really with great pride that we're here today and present this huge report. And I mean, thank you for your words, but really, I mean, this report is you, Robin. It's really, I mean, you have no idea like what we went through, but it's really, I mean, we're very proud of this big piece and the team that has worked.
Thank you very much. So I think we can say thank you to the panel. Before we do so, I just wanted to note that next week, continuation of the discussion that we're having in the Department of Media and Communications, we're going to have an event on tech and big tech within the education space. So it's a continuation of what we were already discussing. That's on Tuesday. It is now Hillman who's going to come and talk about the book they wrote. So if you're interested, please get in touch. And we can give you the details myself. But I think for now, what we really should do is just, again, everybody has been involved in that kind of work. And so I would like to say thank you to our panelists.